Hi folks, and welcome to the Scare Cellar, your spot for horror, mystery, and more. My name is Emily, and today we'll be taking a closer look at The Shining. Warning, this video does contain mature content and viewer discretion is advised. Also, spoiler alert, so if you have not seen The Shining, be sure to earmark this video for later, go watch this wonderful movie, and then come back to hear my thoughts and share yours. Please be sure to leave your comments and your film suggestions in the comment box below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the film that I reviewed today and others that you think that I should take a look at. And if you're into horror and you love horror movies, please do hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get into it. Here's The Shining. The Shining is a horror classic from Stanley Kubrick. It was released in 1980 and is based on the novel by Stephen King. It centers around a family who has gone to a hotel in the Colorado Rockies to live in isolation over the winter while the hotel is closed for its off-season. The Shining definitely falls into the category of psychological horror. As far as other titles that are related to it, if you're interested in them, there is Dr. Sleep, which was released in 2019. It is a feature-length film starring Ewan McGregor, and he stars as Danny Torrance, who is the son in the original Shining movie. He has returned to the Overlook Hotel and is still struggling with some of the traumatic experiences that he had there. There is also a series on HBO Max that is scheduled for sometime in the near future. It will be called Overlook, and it is coming from J.J. Abrams and Bad Robot Productions. We don't have a release date yet, but it was announced in April of this year, 2020. In The Shining, Jack Nicholson stars as Jack Torrance, the central figure of the story. Jack Nicholson is, of course, one of the most well-recognized and highly awarded actors of our time. He has been nominated for nearly 60 different awards, received 14, and he is one of only 6 performers in history to receive 3 Oscars for acting. Playing Wendy Torrance, Jack's wife, is Shelley Duvall, who has been honored by the Cannes Film Festival and received a Peabody Award. Playing Danny Torrance is 6-year-old Danny Lloyd. Danny Lloyd has retired from acting as of age 10, so he had a short run, and is today a college professor. The final main character in the film is Dick Halloran. He is the head chef at the Overlook Hotel, and he is played by legendary actor and musician Scatman Crothers. Scatman Crothers did receive some honors for his performance in The Shining, and he also received an NAACP Image Award for his accomplishments throughout his life. The film was directed by the legendary Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick is also responsible for Full Metal Jacket, Eyes Wide Shut, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Spartacus, A Clockwork Orange, and more. At this point, I also like to cover a little bit about what my preconceptions were, as well as the public when the film was released. So I have seen the film before. I know it in its modern time as a classic horror film. I've definitely always had some bits that kind of freaked me out and some parts that maybe I didn't fully understand, because it is psychological horror, so you can be interpreting things a lot of different ways. When the film was promoted, leading up to 1980 when it was released, it was promoted as a masterpiece of horror. So they definitely put a lot of hype and a lot of energy into promoting the film, and we'll talk a little bit more about how it was received. As I shared, the film was released in 1980, and the setting of the film is 1970s Colorado Rockies, and it is set in the Overlook Hotel. Now, the Overlook Hotel, of course, is fictional, but is based on the Timberland Lodge, which is located in Oregon, near Oregon's Mount Hood. So it is a real place that you can visit. And fun fact, Room 237 is a central focus in the film. In the book, it was actually Room 217, but the Timberland Lodge actually had a Room 217, and the management did not want to scare people away from renting that room. So they changed it to 237 for the film, but maybe surprisingly, maybe not, Room 217 at the Timberland Lodge is the most popular room requested ever. So The Shining focuses on a family, the Torrance family. Husband Jack is an aspiring writer and also a recovering alcoholic. Wife Wendy stays home with son Danny, who is 6. And the family is living in an apartment. They've moved around a little bit, it seems, and Jack has the opportunity to take this job as the off-season caretaker of the Overlook Hotel. He's thinking, great, we're going to go up into the mountains. It's going to be beautiful there. We're going to have this whole hotel to ourselves. I'll be getting paid to write and to take a little bit of R&R as well. So the family moves up to the Overlook Hotel for the winter. When we first meet the family, we immediately have some indication that there are some issues going on. So we see that, you know, Jack may have had some issues with alcohol and maybe some anger problems. Danny shows some different behaviors. He has an imaginary friend that he speaks to. More often than not, he uses his finger to speak to his friend, or this is the voice of his friend, is Tony. And Wendy actually talks to Tony. So Wendy doesn't discourage her son from having an imaginary friend. She understands that he has had some traumatic experiences, and she wants to give him some kind of coping mechanism, as I think most moms would. When the family arrives at the Overlook Hotel, they're given a tour by several members of the staff, including Dick Halloran, who is the head chef of the Overlook Hotel. While Dick is giving a tour of the kitchen to Wendy and Danny, she ends up chit-chatting with him, and he ends up calling Danny a nickname, Doc, which is something that Jack and Wendy call Danny, but they didn't call him that in front of Dick. And so there's an indication there that maybe he can see or sense some things that aren't explicitly stated to him. And then shortly after, while Dick is having a conversation verbally with Wendy, he's having a telepathic communication with Danny. And that turns into a conversation between he and Danny over ice cream, where they talk about The Shining. Now, The Shining, as Dick describes it, is a gift, and it's an ability to see things that other people can't see, hear things other people can't hear, and to feel things more deeply. So maybe this is a version of being an empath, or having empathic capabilities, telepathic capabilities. But Dick reassures Danny that when he sees things that maybe aren't so nice, that it's like looking at a picture or watching a movie and it's not really happening. And of course, that's a great foreshadowing into some of the things that are going to happen while they're there. When Jack originally interviewed to take this position, the manager of the hotel did disclose to him that a previous caretaker had gone kind of cabin crazy and had actually taken an axe and murdered his wife and 2 daughters, and then put the barrel of a gun in his mouth and taken his own life. So Jack doesn't seem deterred at all by this. He doesn't seem concerned with it. He says his wife will love that story because she's, you know, a horror movie addict, which I think I can empathize with a little bit. And that it's not a concern for him. But obviously for us as the viewer, we see some serious shit about to go down. As the family starts to get kind of settled in at the hotel, you know, there's some boredom, there's some frustration. You know, Jack is trying to write, but he has writer's block, and Wendy is trying to be supportive, but she ends up irritating him. We see a little bit more of his anger and his dominance starting to come out a little bit more. We see him starting to unravel a little bit. Danny is also left alone quite a bit, and he continues to see some pretty troubling images and visions as he's in the hotel, including 2 little girls who we discover are the daughters of the caretaker previous, and he also sees some other pretty horrifying things. One of the spaces in the hotel that causes some problems is room 237. So when Dick and Danny are having the conversation about him having The Shining, Danny asks him what's in room 237, because he had had some visions or some images in his mind of that room and had a bad feeling about it. And Dick just tried to brush it off and say, there's nothing in that room, there's no reason to go in there, don't ever go in there. Which of course, to a kid, if you tell them, oh, it's nothing, but also don't ever go near it, what are they gonna do, right? They're kids. So Danny, of course, can't leave it alone. And at one point he ends up going to room 237, and when he comes out, he's in an almost catatonic state. He has marks on his neck and his sweater is ripped, and he says that a crazy woman in a bathtub tried to strangle him. So at first, Wendy accuses Jack of hurting Danny, because we hear that there was an instance previously where Jack had been drunk and pulled Danny's arm too hard and dislocated his shoulder. So we have some touches on some domestic issues there. And Jack has already started to kind of fall apart. So this only fuels his fire, being accused of this thing that he didn't do. But eventually Wendy comes around and says, well, Danny is saying that some woman attacked him. Obviously there's someone else in the hotel, because I believe him. So she sends Jack to room 237, and then things just kind of fall apart. Now that you have some history around the film itself and you're caught up on where we're at in the plot, let's jump into the rap sheet. First cut. So the first blood draw in this film is actually at only the 12-minute mark, but it's not a cut, it's a river. Fun fact, it took about 3,000 gallons of blood to create the famous blood coming out of the elevators scene. So this is something that is a flash vision for Danny initially, and it's a scene that's used several times throughout the film. So we get kind of flashes back to it. But the first time we see it is 12 minutes into the movie. On the day of the shoot, the crew filled the elevator compartments with all of the blood, and then they stood in wooden boxes and trunks and all kinds of things because they didn't know what to expect as far as the flow of the blood coming towards them. They set up 4 cameras that were all running at different shutter speeds using different lenses, and they released the 3,000 gallons of blood. That amount of liquid moved furniture, it pushed tables and chairs out of the way, and it filled the whole studio. And there was actually one point where some of the crew members were thinking, oh my gosh, we're gonna drown in fake blood. So Stanley Kubrick wasn't there because he said he just couldn't watch, but after seeing the sequence, he was very happy with the result. Next on the rap sheet is top terror. I think for most people, or for a lot of people, the first time they see The Shining, their top terror would definitely be when Jack Nicholson takes his axe to the bathroom door of their suite, and Wendy is inside holding a knife, screaming for her life. And that is, of course, when the famous line, "Here's Johnny," happens. For me, it has always been the lady in the bathtub. She freaks me out so bad. I think it's a combination of the fact that she moves very slowly and very calmly at first. So there's kind of a Frankenfurter anticipation kind of moment. But when Jack is kissing her and then sees, he finally opens his eyes, and in the mirror he can see that he's holding this rotting flesh, and she's no longer young and beautiful, she's old and falling apart and laughing maniacally. I mean, that part just super grossed me out and has always freaked me out worse than any other part of the movie, worse than little girls laying covered in blood, worse than axes, worse than freezing in the snow, worse than all of that. So that's my top terror. Next up, the one-liner I love. Now, of course, with The Shining, you know, there's "Here's Johnny," there's lots of great one-liners. "You've always been the caretaker here, come play with us." There's definitely some great lines that most people would recognize from the film. For me, which is, of course it's dark, right? Okay, this is a horror channel. Welcome to my channel. I'm weird. But my favorite one-liner is, so when we finally figure out that Jack is like completely lost it and the family's in danger, Wendy is running around with a baseball bat, and she is walking backwards up a flight of stairs slowly and trying to get away from Jack, who is approaching her. And he's saying, "I'm not gonna hurt you, I'm not gonna hurt you." And she's like, "Get away, get away." And she's swatting at him with the bat, and you think, oh my gosh, she's so toast, the way that she's swinging it. But she comes out swinging when the time comes. But I digress. So my favorite part is Jack says to her, you know, "Honey, you're not listening to me." And he kind of stops her and he goes, "I'm not gonna hurt you, I'm just gonna bash your brains in." And so that's one of my favorite lines of the movie, because he's so soft and so gentle, and he's trying to do this kind of mansplaining, calm down the woman thing, but of course he's saying exactly what he intends to do. And so I think that's a point where Jack before the Overlook and Jack at the Overlook are kind of intermingled. The devil's in the details. So a couple of the details about this film that I absolutely love. First of all, the interior design. This hotel is just dripping in 70s, like, gorgeous, but also ridiculous, right? It's a combination. The rug patterns and the color palettes are just gorgeous and crazy, and they're just so quintessentially 70s. And for someone like me who was born in the late 80s, maybe it's because seeing films like this, that's in my mind what the 70s looked like. But I just think that the combination of some of the textiles that they were using and the color stories is just gorgeous inside of this hotel. And it definitely gives you the idea that the Torrance family is in a setting that is not comfortable or familiar to them. But as we find out, Jack's been there before, and so he's not really as out of place as we maybe think he is. The other detail that I absolutely love is all of Shelley Duvall's costumes. So Wendy Torrance is the stay-at-home mountain mom chic when she is in this film. So when we're introduced to her, we see her in a denim house dress or a blue house dress, and she's got little ruffles on her shoulders, and it's super cute. And she definitely looks like a mom who's spending all day playing with her kiddo and cooking and cleaning and doing that stay-at-home mom kind of gig. And then when we go up to the mountains, you can see that she's kind of dressing the part. She's got all these cozy turtlenecks, and she's wearing a little overall dress and, you know, knee-high lace-up fur boots. She's got more great jumpers. So her costuming is just fantastic. And I think that it gives her a really endearing quality. She feels like someone that you could have known at some point. And even when she gets to the hotel the first time, you know, she's wearing a blazer, but she still has a skirt and little boots and a little turtleneck on. So she's cute, but you can tell that she dressed up a little bit because she's meeting her husband's bosses and she wants this to go well. So you can see a lot about her personality, her style of being a mom, the kind of wife that she is, in how she's dressed. One thing that I think horror movies can sometimes do a really great job of is providing social commentary. So there are some pretty heavy topics in this film, and I'll go through each of the ones that really stood out to me. So first of all, there is alcoholism and domestic violence. It's established very early in the film that Jack has had issues in the past with alcohol, and that has caused or been a factor in him being a little overly physical with his family. Actually, when he is drunk and yanks Danny's arm and dislocates his shoulder, Wendy actually talks about that being the catalyst for Danny talking to Tony. So obviously traumatic, and a starting point for a lot of the things that unravel throughout this film and the time leading up to it. When Jack pulls up a stool at the hotel bar and is met with the ghost bartender who serves him bourbon, he mentions that he is giving up 5 months of sobriety. Jack also says, while sitting at the bar later, when Wendy has accused him of putting his hands on Danny when it was actually the woman in 237, he says that that happened 3 years ago. But Wendy had said that the catalyst for him to stop drinking was when he dislocated Danny's shoulder, and so he said that was 5 months of sobriety gone away. So he is even trying to distance himself from his own abuse of his family. While his issues with domestic violence were somewhat minimal, which I don't say that to minimize what he did, but in the grand scheme of where he goes from there, it's definitely a beginning point. When Jack meets Grady, Delbert Grady, who is the former caretaker, but he appears as a waiter in the ballroom, they go to the bathroom and they're talking because Grady spilled some things on Jack's coat and wanted to clean it. And Grady reveals to Jack that Danny is attempting to contact outside forces and bring them into what he refers to as this situation. And he tells Jack, basically, you need to take care of your family. and you need to get them out of the way, and is encouraging him to literally kill his family. And Jack is just nodding and, yeah, I promise I'm going to take care of it. I promise it's going to be handled. And so that transition to where he all of a sudden accepts that he has a bartender in front of him when there's no one else in the hotel, and he's serving him liquor that he's actually able to drink when the hotel bar had been cleaned out before the owners and management left, to now the ballroom is completely full of people in 1920s clothing having a party, to getting spilled on by a bartender or by a waiter, and then being told in the bathroom by that person, you need to kill your family. His suspension of disbelief happens very quickly and is very intense. Once Jack has started to really unbolt, there's a point where Danny goes into their suite to get a toy. Jack is supposed to be sleeping because he wasn't able to sleep the night before, but he's just sitting on the edge of his bed in almost a vegetative state. He's just staring out the window, totally shut down. And he motions for Danny to come over and sit with him, and he's telling him how he loves him. And Danny says, "Dad, you'd never hurt me or Mom, would you?" And you can see that Jack's first thought, and then he articulates, is, Wendy is putting ideas in my son's head that I'm a threat to him. And then from that point to when he is telling Wendy he's going to bash her brains in is not a very long amount of time. Another topic that the film doesn't maybe directly make commentary on, but is definitely laced with, is the treatment of people of color. Dick Halloran, the chef at the Overlook, is a black man, and when he is initially introduced to the Torrance family by the management, everyone is very polite. They shake hands. Dick takes Wendy and Danny on a tour of the kitchen, shows them the pantries, shows them the freezer, and all of this is very positive and very warm, great conversation. And then at one point, Wendy and Jack leave Danny with Dick, and they go off to another part of the hotel. So they are impressed enough with him and trust him enough to leave their son with him on the first time they meet him. Later, when Grady and Jack are having a conversation in the ballroom restroom, Grady uses the N-word to describe Dick. And he says that Danny is attempting to contact an N-word cook. Now, I went back and rewatched this several times to see what Jack's reaction was. He does repeat the word back to him, but I had to watch it a few times and make sure I understood the tone and the way that he was saying it. I'm not sure if this contrast and social commentary is intentional on Kubrick's part, but Grady is already established as a ghost from the 1920s when this kind of language and that kind of perspective was more commonplace. During the time that this film was set and produced, the New Right was a counter movement to the civil rights movement that was emerging, and this was focusing on environmental rollbacks on women's rights, rollbacks on civil rights, all in the name of business freedoms. Kubrick's use of Grady and Jack in the bathroom scene does seem somewhat intentional to me. Initially, Jack was polite and trusting of Dick Halloran, and then at this point, when Grady presents him as an issue, that is all Jack sees him as, a wrench in his plan, which his plan seems to be unfolding in front of him. He doesn't really seem to know what is going to happen next any more than we do as the viewer. I personally think that this is commentary around something that I call kindness of convenience, where there are plenty of white people today still who will not go out of their way to be cruel or unkind to people of color. They may be polite, they may be socially positive with them, but if something were to happen to that person or a group is targeted, they're not going to go out of their way to stop it. They're not going to put themselves in any kind of position of question or danger or even inconvenience to stand up for someone who looks differently than they do. And I think that that's definitely the camp that Jack falls into, is the kindness of convenience. We also see some indications of a conversation around Indigenous peoples in this film. Throughout the film, the sets actually communicate a lot of Native American artwork and motifs. And initially, when we get introduced to the Overlook Hotel, we're told that it was built on an Indian burial ground. There have been many reviewers of this film who have said that this is Kubrick's direct commentary on the treatment and terror imposed on indigenous peoples in the US and the accompanying terror of imperialism. Jack even references a poem by Rudyard Kipling when he is sitting at the hotel bar. He picks up his cup of bourbon and says, "The white man's burden." Now, these things are not explicitly commentary on people of indigenous background and how they've been treated, but there is certainly a theme that emerges when you look at all of these factors. Finally, there are other film critics who have seen The Shining as Kubrick's commentary on the Holocaust. It has been asserted that Kubrick omitted much of the supernatural aspects of Stephen King's novel and instead amplified the emotions of the characters inside the hotel, as hotels were a common place where a lot of the atrocities of the Holocaust happened. Kubrick also chose musical compositions for the film that were written post-World War II and influenced by the horrors of the genocide. Kubrick had always wanted to direct a film that specifically focused on the Holocaust, but he never found the right project. So perhaps The Shining is the closest that he ever got to that goal. Alright folks, it's review time. Overall, The Shining is a masterpiece of horror, of psychological horror more specifically. Initially, it was not received by audiences in an overwhelmingly positive way. A lot of people didn't get it. A lot of people didn't understand what the hype prior was about. Some people felt Jack Nicholson was too sinister from the get-go, so his unraveling wasn't as contrasted as it could have been, because Jack Nicholson had just actually come off of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and some other performances, and had kind of established himself as a slightly creepy individual on screen. So when he was chosen for the part, people went into the theater expecting him to be creepy and scary and sinister. So they got docked a little bit for that in the audience expectation, I guess. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't have a fantastic performance, and I certainly agree that it's one of his best performances ever. Now, overall, for my review, I would say that I love The Shining. I think it's a great film. I love that it is not definite in a lot of it, because everyone can have a different interpretation. So some people are going to see this film and they're going to resonate with different characters, they're going to resonate with some different aspects of it. So I love that there are things that are open to interpretation. I love watching horror movies with friends and then trying to figure out what this meant and that meant, and listening to different perspectives. So as far as films that make you think, this is definitely one of those. So I have a few different ways that I calculate my my review scale. So first of all is the gore gauge. So the gore, of course, is the blood and guts and all of that kind of stuff in a film. Who doesn't love gore if you love horror? So I give The Shining a 3 out of 5 on my gore gauge. Obviously, the elevator blood scene is iconic and it's used several times throughout the film, but besides that, there's really not a lot of violence or blood or anything like that. There's some more flash scenes, things that Danny is seeing in his mind with his shine. So not a ton of blood and gore, but enough definitely to satisfy a horror fan. Next is the scare scale. So on a scale of 1 to 5, I give The Shining a 4 out of 5, thinking back to my first time watching it, and then also as I watched it again over the past couple days. There are definitely some parts that still freak me out quite a bit. Like I mentioned, the lady in the bathtub, not a big fan. But at the same time a big fan, because I like how she freaks me out. I think that the scariest parts of this film are ones that are high tension and drawn out, and I think that it does a really great job of playing on some of our own personal fears and anxieties, isolation, and even some things that maybe are a little bit more traumatic for some people. The idea of being stuck in a violent relationship or a relationship that is tainted by alcohol abuse, those things are scary, and they definitely play into the overall fear factor or the scare scale of the film. For social impact, I gave The Shining a 2 out of 5. They're definitely not making big intentional social commentary in this film. There are topics that are brought up, that are discussed, or that maybe are sprinkled throughout the film. There are definitely a lot of themes that can be tied together, but just like the film itself, you don't really know what the intention was behind some of that, so we can't be definitive in that scoring. I do have a bonus category where I give a couple of bonus points if a film is what I call a genre jumper. Genre jumper means it's a horror movie, but maybe it has some elements of romance or comedy. This film, I think the psychological thriller piece of it is so critical to what makes it a classic, but also something that was never seen before, we probably won't see again. So the psychological thriller gives that 2 bonus points on my scales. So all totaled up, we are looking at a score of 3.5 out of 5 for The Shining. Now, I love The Shining. I think that it was a trailblazing film in its time, and we definitely haven't seen anything like it since. It's a great movie to watch with friends. If you're still staying home, staying safe with the pandemic, you could do a watch party. I rented it on Amazon Prime for a few dollars, so that was money well spent, especially for a 2.5-hour movie. So I would definitely recommend that if you haven't seen it, that you take the time to watch it, and even if you have, maybe watch it again and see if some of the things I've talked about pop up for you this time. Until next time, I will leave you with what I tell my 2 sons every day of their lives, which is be kind and make good choices. I will also ask you to please stay spooky and take care of each other. Bye-bye.